Hey guys, it's Alexander Williamson here with The Secret History Living in Your Aquarium. Today we're going to be talking about nitrifying bacteria versus denitrifying bacteria. Now, these are both bacteria groups that are on the same spectrum, in the same circle of life in our aquariums, in the ecosystem, in the world. They are both different sides of the same coin. And with a lot of the methods that we hear about these days, we hear things like anoxic filtration, anaerobic filtration, anaerobic nitrifying bacteria, denitrifying bacteria, BSB filtration or BSB basket filtration, under gravel plenum things. So there's a lot of these buzzwords and terms that are going around lately, but it all comes down to really understanding what nitrifying bacteria is, how it really works in your aquarium and in a wild ecosystem or nature at large for the last billion years, and also understanding what denitrifying is, because nitrifying bacteria is taking ammonia and it's breaking it down into nitrites, then to nitrates. This is the cycle that you're really familiar with if you're a fish keeper. And if you love plants and you're a gardener and you've got the deeper substrates, you want to fix that down in the soil and the substrate so your plants can eat that, so that they can take that nourishment and grow with it. But you don't want those levels too high, and we know as fish keepers that the nitrates are safer than the nitrites or the ammonia, which your fish produce and excrete, as well as decomposing plant material creates. And so we want to minimize that in the ambient water, yet we want to maximize it in the soil, but not too high. I mean, there's a point that's too high also. So how does nature create that balance, and what does it really mean when we say it's a nitrifying bacteria or denitrifying? So when we have nitrifying, we know that that fixes it into the cycle, but with denitrifying bacteria, we can actually take the ammonia and the nitrate, we can actually break that apart in its most basic atomic level, and you can off-gas it in the form of water and nitrogen or nitrogen gas, oxygen gas, O2 as it is. And so we're going to go over that now, and we're going to get a good understanding, a deep dive this time, on what that means. So get your chemistry hat on, get your fish nerd hat on, and hopefully when we talk about this, it'll help you understand things like when we talk about anoxic or low oxygen environments and what that means for bacteria and what bacteria live in those environments. When we talk about anaerobic, which is no oxygen, and when we talk about aerobic, which is oxygen-rich environments, like the hang-off-the-back filter here, or like the surface area here, or the top levels of the substrate. And we're going to talk about how those different areas are all part of this nitrogen cycle. So let's jump in, get ready, and I hope you're excited to learn about the nitrogen universe. Alright guys, I hope this is an acceptable view for you. So while we talk about this very important topic, let's first talk about what nitrifying bacteria are versus denitrifying bacteria. We went over it a little bit in the beginning, but let's take a deep dive into all of this. So nitrification is an essential process as it helps provide nitrates to plants. This acts as a source of elemental nitrogen for the plants. It helps them grow, and also it helps them put off nitrogen gas as well as O2. We think of plants making oxygen, but they also put out nitrogen, and the atmosphere we breathe is 75%, somewhere between 70 and 80. It really depends, actually, depending on elevation and city and pollutants, but somewhere around there, it is mostly nitrogen. And a lot of you may know that, but it's mostly nitrogen, then oxygen, and then we've got other trace elements. So the nitrogen cycle is not just in our aquariums and underwater for our plants, but it's actually something we breathe as well. Now, denitrification is also important because it sounds like it's eliminating nitrogen, but what it's actually doing is it's breaking down nitrogen, or it's fixing nitrogen into new roles in the soil. So denitrification is an important process because it ensures that the cyclical movement of nitrogen from the atmosphere and the ambient soil gets into the plants and then back to the atmosphere. So it also plays an important role in breaking down decomposition, dying things, wastewater. When we go to treat our sewage and things like that, it's also important there. But it's also how our aquariums can filter the waste. So there are lots of different little organisms that perform nitrification, and let's just kind of go through the differences between nitrification, which, remember, that is taking the ammonia and turning it into nitrites and then into nitrates, and then the plants can use that. It puts it into the soil. Whereas denitrification is taking that already processed nitrogen in the form of nitrates usually, but it can also be ammonia and other compounds, and it is breaking it apart and regassing it off into the atmosphere or into other bacteria, other fungi, plants, other things that use nitrogen, breaking it down into a usable form. So this occurs at various levels, and when we talk about the nitrifying cycle or the nitrogen cycle, we always think of, in the fish hobby, the anaerobic versus aerobic battle. But that's not the whole story. There are over 150 different species that now we've identified and found in all sorts of environments, from all the way in geothermal vents that are super hot, to areas with no oxygen and tons of sulfur, to areas without sulfur, to areas rich in iron or manganese or magnesium. So it is a ubiquitous part of the circle of life. And so I want to go through and talk about nitrifying versus denitrifying microbes and where we find them, what they're about. Kind of a, here's the nitrifying, here's the denitrifying. So first of all, nitrifying and nitrification, nitrifying bacteria usually happens in areas that are high concentration oxygen. That's not always the case, but usually. Whereas microorganisms that perform denitrification are usually under low oxygen, that's anoxic, or anaerobic, or no oxygen that's free, environments. Now, most microbes involved in nitrification are chemoautotrophic, which means that they take the elements and the chemicals out of the environment, and that's what they eat. Heterotrophic means us, like animals that eat plants and need a source of nutrients, where chemotrophic would be, or autotrophic would be plants that use sun, they use sunlight, or a parasitic connection where they just use, for instance, elemental compounds in a rock, or lithotrophic. So when we're talking about these microbes, most of them are chemoautotrophic or heterotrophic. So they're eating things, they're not the bottom of the food chain. Whereas most microbes that are involved in denitrification, they are heterotrophic, so they're really not the bottom of the food chain. So they're not at all just breaking down, single chemicals, but they have to live on that nitrogen or on that ammonia oftentimes. Now, for nitrification, the bacteria, nitrifying bacteria, really flourish from 6.5 to 8 pH. Denitrifying bacteria is more of a 7.0 to 9.0, or a more alkaline range. So when you have an aquarium that's too acidic, you can actually kill off all that good bacteria that helps us detoxify our aquarium. Now, if you want to be taking the nitrates out of the soil and actually returning them to ammonia, for instance, maybe you don't want nitrates, you want more ammonia in the soil for your plants, but you don't want it in the water. This is kind of next level in understanding the cycle of nitrates. Well, if you want that, then you want that denitrifying bacteria. You want it to be able to hand that pure ammonia over to the plants. But you want it to do it at a slow pace, because if it happens too quick, it can burn or poison the plants. Just like too much of a good thing is not good for us either. So this is why people are starting now to realize that there's not just the anaerobic versus aerobic, like we talked about, cycles. There's not just the oxygen-loving bacteria that fixes nitrogen, but there's actually an entire cycle going on in our substrates, in our suboxygenated regions and in our non-oxygenated regions, and everything from different types of bacteria that you see banding in the substrate here and down below a little bit. That is all different levels of this ecosystem that is living and flourishing and continuing on. So as we think about this ecosystem, nitrifying bacteria lives in the 20 to 30 Celsius range. So we're talking, something like 68 to 85, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Whereas when we look at the range of denitrifying, it needs hotter, warmer conditions generally. Generally, we're talking about 26 to 38 Celsius, anywhere from, 75, 76 degrees, all the way up to, 100 degrees Fahrenheit is where it thrives. So a lot of times that's deep in the substrate, or deeper in the substrate, as you've ever seen a manure pile or a pile of wood chips or mulch. It gets hot, it steams. Well, this is because of that nitrification, denitrifying bacteria battle going on between the surface and internally. So when we think about it in an overall sense, nitrification involves the conversion of reduced nitrogen compounds into oxidized forms. Denitrification involves the conversion of oxidized nitrogen compounds in reduced forms on that end of things. The end production of nitrification is going to be nitrate, which is NO3 negative. The end production of denitrification is going to be either nitrous oxide or nitrogen gas. N2 or NO2 is the nitrous oxide, and byproducts, water or oxygen, O2. So nitrifying bacteria are present in distinct taxonomical groups and are found in the highest numbers where there are considerable amounts of buildup in the material that they would eat. That makes sense, right? So in the wild, you find them in marshes, in lakes, in swamps, in that top level of rich humus soil, and also in, sewage treatment plants and places like that, dung piles and things like that in grazing herd areas. Nitrifying bacteria thrive in lakes, rivers, streams, with high inputs and outputs of wastewater from biological creatures, which, makes sense, right? So the oxidation of ammonia to nitrates in nature is a two-step process of oxidation. So it takes the ammonia, or NH4+, that's ammonium, sorry. Ammonia is NH3. Either way, though, it's poisonous, it's toxic. One is a gas, one is a liquid, or a solid. And it converts it into nitrite. We know that cycle. And then to nitrates. So we all know that, but it's catalyzed by two ubiquitous bacterial groups that are growing together. They always grow together. They're symbiotic. And the first reaction is the oxidation of ammonium to nitrite by the ammonium oxidizing bacteria group. Those are called AOB bacterias. They're represented by members of the beta protobacteria groups and the gamma protobacteria groups. Further organisms involved and able to oxidize ammonia are also archaea, and those are known as AOAs, or archaea oxidizing anaerobes. The second reaction in nature that occurs in these systems that are always together is the consolidation, and it's the oxidation of the nitrite, or NO2 negative, to nitrate. And that's by taking the nitrite oxidizing bacteria species, which we find in our aquariums. And so this is why we test for nitrites and nitrates. So we know if the nitrates are present, we know that the nitrites were broken down. The ammonia was broken down into nitrites, and then the nitrites were broken into nitrates. So that's the two-step process, and it's two different bacterias. And the second group of bacteria, the nitrite oxidizing bacterias, or NOBs, are present in several groups of bacteria species that we culture in our aquariums. It doesn't really matter which of these it is, they're all very effective, but there is the Nitrospiniae, the Nitrospirae, and the Protobacteriae, and as well as the Chloroflexii. And there's also a few of our photosynthetic blue algae or cyanobacterias that play a role in this too. So nitrifying bacteria are chemolithotropic. We were talking about the different ways. So litho meaning stone, chemo meaning chemical. And so they're organisms that include species of the genera Nitrosomonas, Nitrosococcus, Nitrobacters, and Nitrospinas. The Nitrospinas and the Nitrococcus bacteria are the most numerous. They're the most commonly found ones, and they're in our aquariums. They get their energy by the oxidation process of inorganic nitrogen compounds. So they're taking that nitrogen in the environment, and they're oxidating it, and by doing that and by transforming it, that's how they live. So types of this ammonia oxidizing bacteria, or AOB, and NOB, the two different steps, are found all throughout all water ecosystems. And as a cell, as a life form, they have a complex internal membrane system and a location for key enzymes in their body. And they have an enzyme called ammonia monooxygenase, and this is what breaks down the first step of the ammonia. They also have another one called hydroxylaminin oxidoreductase, and it's an oxidizer, and it takes the nitrite and it breaks it down into the nitrates. And currently there's another unidentified enzyme that most of these bacteria have, and we're kind of arguing over that, but historically it was believed to be oxidoreductase oxidizer. So that's kind of what we know about that bacteria, and you can harbor it, you can care for it and keep it up by keeping things oxygenated in your aquarium and by moving water over those bacteria. Now, these bacteria actually have the ability to move. They're little single-cell organisms. They're not always just a mat colony like we would think of bacteria. However, now we're going to talk about the denitrifying section. And that's the simple side of things, understanding what they are, what they do, nitrifying bacteria. Denitrifying bacteria have been identified in far more places, over 50 genera of species, 125 different species within those genera, and they are estimated to represent something like 10 to 15% of all the bacteria population on Earth. They're found in water, soil, and sediment that's moist, and the majority of these denitrifying bacteria are aerobic or heterotrophic. So aerobic meaning that they actually do breathe oxygen. However, there's so many species that there are a lot that are also anaerobic, meaning they don't have any free oxygen in their environment, and they use other methods of chemical synthesis to break things down, and other enzymes, as well as anoxic, which just means they're low oxygen living bacteria in the top crust of soil, but not on the very top with the oxygenation. So when we think about it, they are all heterotrophs. They all need to move around and feed on that nitrogen or ammonia, and then break it apart, and then they basically poop out or expel it as a new metabolized, basically simpler form of the element, and return it back to the environment. And in some cases that's great. Other cases we wouldn't want that in the open water, because that could take the same group of bacteria could take they could take nitrate, turn it into nitrite, turn it into ammonia, then rip it apart. But in the phase of the ammonia going on, that's the exact reverse method that we would want from our normal cycling in our tank. But when it's under a cap of soil, or deep enough even without a cap that it's below the open water of the aquarium, then it actually hands those chemicals, which are far more convenient, right over to your plants. So it's kind of this balance you need to keep, and you don't want to really pop the top on it when we think about it as kind of a layer cake of what's going on. So aerobic denitrifiers can conduct an aerobic respiratory process in which nitrates are converted gradually to NO3 and N2. So they go from NO3 negative to NO2, down to NO, down to N2O, and then down to oxygen free and nitrogen free, or N2, the way you usually find nitrogen, two of them in nature. Using the nitrate reductase and nitrate reductase negative, or NAR and nitrate, so it's NAR and NER, NAR and NIR for short, as well as the nitric oxidase reductase enzymes, and that's NOR, NOR, and then there's nitrous oxide reductase enzymes, or NOS, NOS. So in this bacteria, in denitrifying, in all those steps that we talked about, so from ammonia or ammonium to nitrite to nitrate to nitrogen to elemental nitrogen and oxygen, that's the acronyms they use for the enzymes found in these various bacteria that do it are NAR, then NAO, then NIR, then NOR, and then NOS. So I know that's a lot of jargon for you, but I just want to get it all out there. So if you guys are doing research, I'll put some notes in the community section, and we'll have all this info there for you too. If you're trying to figure out, is a plenum, does that make sense? Or do BSB, do anoxic filtration baskets by like Dr. Novak's method, or Dr. Walsted's method of noticing things ecologically in the aquarium? Which method's right for you, and how can you play with it? That's really what this is about, a deeper level of understanding. So the reaction above that we just talked about, and if you're reading through the notes later, is a half reaction, and it's the process of denitrification. The reaction can then be divided into a different half, the later half, and that requires those specific enzymes that we were talking about. And that's from the nitrate into the nitrite, and then from the nitrite into the final elemental. So when we're thinking about all this, the anaerobic denitrification is coupled with methane and methane oxidation, and that was first observed in 2008. So this is cutting edge science, and the isolation of methadone oxidizing bacterial strains were found then And they thought that they always had to do with nitrogen, but they found out that they're on their own. So now we're questioning whether methane, which is also a decomposing gas found in most carbon-based life forms, plants and animals, we've noticed that things like sulfur and methane are present, and they also are part of what smell bad as they are built into different compounds. Things like putrescine and cadaverine and things like that, as they break down, they off-gas. And it's because of those NIR, NAR, and various enzymes that actually have that effect of condensing these smaller units of the elements, and actually allows them to form into these gas pockets and then leave your system altogether. So you're going to have to get the nitrogen out of your system one way or another, and either that's the plants use it, and if there's too much, or if you don't have plants, maybe you have African cichlids, then you want it to either off-gas out of there, or you want it to be fixed into the substrate and not have to worry about it. But either way, you want it not in your water column. And that's why understanding these various methods is important, and knowing the actual chemical way in which they're broken down. So the process of anaerobic or no oxygen denitrification, they've found out recently, contributes significantly to the global methane and nitrogen gas cycle, and especially in light of recent discovery where they found the methane working separately. They found this in a peat bog, and they found that in different levels of the water, these bacteria, there's different species all throughout it. And they actually are carried on the wind or in the water. And so you don't need to do anything to put them in your aquarium or your tank. Basically, just the sheer factor of existing on you, there'll be these bacterium in the air and on dust particles. They're very small, and they will sooner or later colonize most bodies of water with any sort of ammonia or nitrates in them, or nitrites. So they've also found that this whole process is actually capturing a ton of methane. In fact, they think it may be responsible for the majority of sequestration of methane. And as we mess with things during the Anthropocene, or the human era of doing things on Earth, that's while humans have impacted geology, basically, the Anthropocene, we have noticed that this may be a method for sequestering some of that excess methane that we've produced, that, mass cattle farming, or that things that we do, like, automobiles and industrial work puts off. We're basically breaking it out of its layer, trapped down in these deep spots and these pockets in the nitrogen cycle, where it's designed to be sequestered deep in lake beds and things like that, in the non-oxygen rich environments. And we're breaking it free when we bring things like natural gas and coal and oil and other things like that up. So for a long time it has been kind of a balance, and it's been in one area, and now we've kind of disrupted that. So for a long time it was believed that the mitigation of methane emissions was only due to aerobic, lithotrophic, and chemotrophic bacteria that are also denitrifying. However, now we know that's not true, and in anoxic, so low oxygen and not just oxygen-free areas of deep fresh water specifically, we've found that that's where the methane and these other gases of decomposition are most effectively sequestered. So there was a big study done on a lake called Lake Constance, and they found that the nitrate was completely depleted from the water, gone. It had off-gassed. It was returned back to the world at large, whereas the methane and other hydrocarbons and various gases and things were sequestered at the exact same level of depth when they drilled into the base of the lake. So now we know that the sequestration of a lot of these hydrocarbons and gases is somehow linked with either the same level of depth and the same ecosystem of bacteria, or maybe it's a byproduct of the nitrogen cycle. So this totally blows the top off of everything we thought we knew about what the nitrification cycle is, and it may have to do with the methane cycle and the hydrocarbon cycles, all of them, dozens of them. So this new bacteria, they've also categorized M. oxiferia denitrifying, which goes by MDO, is a bacteria group that carries the methane oxidation process out when they run out of nitrites, and it occurs at that same depth in lakes. And so this is why we think that it's all linked together. And it's just a really fascinating process. And I just wanted you guys to know kind of the actual chemical sense of how things break down in this cycle. So when you look and you see things stratified, just think of it, if you don't take anything else away, that you want in your anoxic layer, you want to have that's kind of your middle layer, and that is your low oxygen layer. There you kind of have, ideally you probably want nitrites and nitrates. And you're simplifying it down, and down deep you can have ammonia, and you can have off-gassing of nitrites, of nitrogen and of oxygen and of water. But your roots, if you have plants, that's where you want the ammonia as well as the nitrites, nitrates, but you want that ammonia fixed by the denitrifying bacteria and nitrifying bacteria groups. Whereas in the middle, you want some of that, and that's the anoxic filtration, and that's slow moving water, whereas the very bottom is still or no moving water with no oxygen. And the middle is slow moving. That's where we think of like plenums in Dr. Novak's thought process. And in the top crust, where we see the algae and the sunlight processing, or chemotrophic, phototrophic life forms, that's where we want the nitrates. And the nitrates are less poisonous, yet your plants can still use them out of the water column. So we want the ammonia to work its way down into the system, then get broken down and then released. But we need nitrifying and denitrifying bacteria to do that. And it turns out that the world is much more complex than we first thought. Surprise, surprise. And that now with the release of all these hydrocarbons and fuels since the Industrial Revolution, we're finding out that these bacteria may play a crucial role in basically locking that back up. And we know that oil and coal and various really rich sources of fuel were from freshwater bogs and marshes from 100, 200, 250 million years ago. But it was freshwater marshes, not necessarily saltwater or land or anything like that. So it is informing us that it is probably these freshwater lakes, rivers, bogs, and floodplains that are responsible for locking away this energy and this excess stuff that life has basically said, I don't want all that stuff to live. I just need some of it on its way to being sequestered. So just think about that whole big global process while you think about the micro process going on in your aquarium. I hope this long talk helped a little for you uber fish nerds or chemistry folks out there, and I will talk to you guys next time on The Secret History Living in Your Aquarium. Thanks, guys.